Hey, everybody. Hey, it's Caileen. I'm excited to be here this week. We're going to be talking about why the live on the Instagram feed is so awful. But it's fine on Nexus. So whatever, we'll catch up. I may have to restart this. Actually, I'm going to restart this. Discard. Sorry, technical difficulties. Oh, I had my Wi-Fi off. You guys, why do they let me on this SciCommunity thing to do anything? Anyway, so today we're going to be talking about faults in wine and your favorite wines. Hopefully this works better. Anyway, so let me know if for some reason the Wi-Fi is just terrible on Instagram and I will adjust it accordingly. It's really spotty on my end and I'm not sure why. But if you follow the SciCommunity on Instagram, I asked them to tell me their favorite wines so we could talk about them. And we're also going to be discussing faults in wine because not every wine that you get is good as far as what production quality would be considered to be good. So we're going to address some of those issues today after we address all of our technical issues. So I am going to, again, restart the Instagram one. How is everybody doing? We're going to talk also today about, we can talk about actually what I did this morning because harvest is always a little bit rough. And when you're bringing in grapes, you want them to be cool when they come into the winery so you can control the times that you're going to be dealing with the fruit. If they come in really hot, they might start fermenting. And so this morning at 6, I got up to start harvesting grapes at 6:30 in the morning. And then after I harvest those grapes, I went to work all day in my PhD, and now I have to go back to the winery after this because something that we need to work is just not working at all. And I have to go up there and troubleshoot so that we can actually make wine, which is kind of insane to think about. So let's see if this works for the live feed on Instagram. Okay, I'm now live. I just had to restart my phone. Oh my goodness, technology is not, it's funny that I'm saying technology is not my strong suit, but I also have to leave this to go to the winery. So even if technology isn't my strong suit, I guess I better figure it out, right? So today we are going to be talking about your favorite wines and faults in wine. And thank you for having the patience to wait a couple minutes while I had to restart my phone because the big secret with being a lab technician or being a wine lab technician is just like any other technician, you have to turn it off and turn it back on, right? So I had to turn my phone off and turn it back on. Lovely. So today I wanted to start off with what wine we're drinking because this is a very special wine to me. This is Broken Top Viognier. This is the vineyard that I harvested this morning with some of my friends. Viognier being a varietal that's grown in the southern Rhone region of France that is very high in terpenes and aromatics. We talked a little bit last week about the kinds of compounds that can go into making a wine be a certain way, and terpenes are one of those things. So pardon me while I crack my bottle of wine because I just sat down. But yes, this morning I harvested the 2018 vintage of this wine, and now I'm going to drink the 2014 vintage. So exciting times here at Evenings of Enology. Hey, everybody. If you were paying attention to the stories, you noticed that I put in a prompt asking you what your favorite wine was and to comment on it. And I just wanted to say thank you to everybody because a lot of y'all really liked Malbec. And I was not expecting that. And I am so flippin' happy that so many of you like Malbec. Malbec is a varietal that's also really close to my heart because it's really common in Argentina. And I don't think I've said it on this before, but I used to be a tango instructor and I still am a tango dancer. And so Malbec to me is a very special varietal, and I really enjoy it. So we're going to talk about Malbec first and foremost. Malbec is a varietal that 4 of you apparently really enjoy, which is lovely, including Taylor. Malbec is a varietal that was originally from the Cahors region of France. It was actually called the black grape of Cahors because as a grape itself, it has a very high skin to flesh ratio. And what that does is it extracts a lot of anthocyanins, and it makes it, and just that's innate to the varietal as well. It's not necessarily just associated with berry size, but it makes for a very thick, dark, rich wine. And so it's called the black grape of Cahors, which is a region in the south of France. However, it wasn't deemed to be of high enough quality to be grown in that region of France, and it kind of got kicked out. And it got adopted as sort of the grape of Argentina. And Argentina, the Mendoza region of Argentina, the Uco Valley of Argentina, has been growing Malbec with high prominence since about the 1980s. Obviously before that as well, but it's been gaining popularity for the last 30 or 40 years. And as a varietal, Malbec, if that was your favorite wine, Malbec is very high in pyrazines, which we talked about. So we talked about these pyrazinic molecules last week, and they are in the family of Bordeaux varietals, which someone said they also really like Bordeaux. And they give rise to that kind of green pepper characteristic. It's not as strong as in Cab Sauv or Cab Franc, but you're still going to get that pyrazinic quality in Malbec. So that's something that you can always look for in a Malbec. Malbec will also typically be treated with oak, almost always, just because it is so tannic and it is so robust. So you may get some of those oak lactone flavors, and you may get some of the mouthfeel of the oak. You're also going to be getting in Malbec some of those like peppery kind of, oh, hey, thank you, Philippe. Oh my gosh, I cannot pronounce your handle. Please feel free to pronounce your actual names in the chat so I don't screw up your handle or your name. So it's also high in that kind of black pepper sort of leathery characteristic. And then as far as fruit character is concerned, Malbec is typically like darker fruit. So I think of like blackberries and brandied cherries and but those are in the background. What you really get more of in the foreground is that kind of like savory kind of flavor. So if Malbec were one of the ones that you chose, A, you just kind of won my heart over a little bit. And B, those are some of the characteristics of Malbec. Another wine that somebody picked, which I don't really think they realize how complicated this wine is, but Moscato. So does anybody in the chat drink Moscato? I actually don't drink a ton of Moscato, but Moscato, we typically think of Moscato when we think of Moscato d'Asti. So in old world wines, you'll have sometimes a varietal, but oftentimes you'll just have a region. In Italy, they have a system sometimes, like in Moscato, where they have a region and a varietal. So Moscato is actually Italian for muscat. And muscat is a varietal that is crazy weird. There's something like 200 different clones or sub-varietals of muscat. It's insane. Typically what we drink when we drink Moscato is Moscato Bianco. So white muscat or muscat canelli sometimes. And those are the kind of go-to gold standards for muscat. But muscat is interesting, or Moscato, sorry. Moscato is interesting in the sense that it is fermented to a very low ABV, and it's intended to have residual sugar on it. So if you enjoy wines that have a little bit of sweetness or residual sugar to them, and you like a little bit of bubbles, you may enjoy Moscato. And it's fermented to the ABV that they're desiring, anywhere from 5 to 9%, because it's going to differ you between Moscato d'Asti or Asti. A little confusing. But what happens is they measure that fermentation, and they see when it gets to about 5 to 9% alcohol by volume, and then they just filter the wine. So what that does is anything that's going to cause a wine to ferment is going to be from a microorganism like yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, ideally. So if you filter out your wine and you filter out your Saccharomyces cerevisiae, they can no longer ferment anything. And so you stop your fermentation at whatever ABV it is that you want. And then you bottle that stuff under carbonation and you're good to go. And that's how you get sparkling Moscato. So Moscato, as a characteristic of a wine, will almost always have a little bit of residual sugar. It'll be kind of apricot-y, sort of white flour, kind of lychee. It'll actually taste like grapes. So Muscat as a grape is also really interesting. There's actually some Muscat at the vineyard I was at this morning. They're pretty big berries, all things considered. You may even be able to mistake them for just table grapes, but they're not. They're Vitis vinifera, but a very, very interesting varietal. So if that was your favorite varietal, your favorite wine, Moscato, that is what Moscato is and what it tastes like and where it comes from and how we make it. Another one that I saw that I really liked, and again, please, if you didn't get to like put your answer in the info box and you're like, yo, Caileen, I love this wine, please let me know. And I will tell you what your wine is like. Hopefully I know about it. I should know about it. It's my job to know about it. This is always so weird, just like sitting and talking to your phone about wine. You're like, this is normal. Every normal human being sits and talks to their phone about wine on Tuesday nights. Very normal. Somebody also said Gewürztraminer. So has anybody heard of Gewürztraminer? It's kind of a mouthful. I'm surprised the person spelled it right also. Like 10 spelling points to you for spelling Gewürztraminer right. Good job. Are there any parts of harvest that are unique to some specific types of wine? Oh, fantastic question, Kyle. Yes. So the easiest answer, oh, hi, Jenny from Washington. Hey, nice to see you again. Jenny's on Nexus and Kyle is on Instagram. So yes, Kyle, there definitely are. And I think the best example of that is a dessert wine or an ice wine. So oftentimes, and champagne as well. So there are certain varietals or certain styles of winemaking that need you to harvest your grapes with a different physiological characteristic. So for champagne, we want to harvest our grapes with really high acid. And we actually want to harvest them at pretty low Brix because we're going to have to do a secondary fermentation on that still wine. And as a consequence, if the alcohol level is too high, you're not actually going to get a secondary fermentation in the bottle. And you're going to get a stuck ferment and nothing's going to create bubbles and you're not going to have champagne. So champagne grapes, you harvest a little bit earlier with a little bit higher acid, which is why champagne grapes typically come from really cool climates. And on the opposite end of that spectrum, you may harvest something like a dessert wine really late. With the example of an ice wine. So ice wines are common in the Okanagan Valley of British Columbia, Canada, but they're also in a bunch of other places. And with ice wines, you physically let the grapes hang on the vine until after the first frost. And what that first frost does is it sucks some of the water out. And when that water then falls back down to the ground, what you're left with is a dehydrated grape that is dehydrated by the freezing and thawing process, not by raisination. And so what that does is it doesn't caramelize any of the sugars like you would get from potentially a sunburn or something like that, but it just concentrates the sugar. And it also creates a change in acid profile as well. So that's another example of when you might harvest something different. And then there are just some varieties that need to hang for longer because they're just a pain in the, like a varietal that I really love, Carignan. Carignan's a beautiful varietal, pain in the ass. Huge pain in the ass. Typically, you can't harvest good Carignan until the latter quarter, like the last 20% of your harvest is going to be maybe Carignan if you're harvesting it. And at that point, you're fighting potentially rain, which means you're potentially fighting mold. Carignan itself just looks like a vine with a bad hair day. It's kind of a pain in the ass. So yes, absolutely. That is a fantastic question. And there definitely are parts of harvest that are unique to some specific types of wine, whether that's winemaking or the varietal being a pain in the ass. Jenny from Washington, she's like, I can go to Instagram and make this a lot easier for you. Thanks, Jenny. You're awesome. Hi, Jenny. So Gewürztraminer. So someone said that they like Gewürztraminer and they spelled it right. 10 internet points to you. Very hard varietal. So Gewürztraminer is a varietal that is grown most commonly in the Alsace region of France, but it's also oftentimes a German wine as well, Gewürztraminer. And it's very common to more cool climates, and it has a very intense bouquet. So the nose on Gewürztraminer is just insane. It can be a little spicy. It can be a little gingery. It can be like rich apricot, and every now and again it's also made with residual sugar, which is really lovely. Gewürztraminer also makes really fantastic late harvest dessert wines. Beautiful, beautiful dessert wines. But it's in that family of high terpene white wines that also pair really well with spicy foods, by the way, oddly enough. So Gewürztraminer, very high Gewürztraminer. Yes, Jenny, exactly. Gewürztraminer. Excellent. Good job spelling as well. So yeah, very high terpene wine, very aromatic, very thick kind of mouthfeel, whether that's from residual sugar or from glycerol or from a handful of other things that can cause viscosity in wine. And common to France, Germany sort of region, but is also grown in other areas. There's a little bit of it grown in Washington as well. Another varietal that someone said they love Pinot. Pinot is a very common varietal to love. And I have a soft spot in my heart for Pinot as well. We have a lot of Pinot in the cellar right now. Well, fermenting, and some in barrel, actually from 2017 still. We haven't bottled it yet, of course. But Pinot is a varietal that was most commonly associated with the Burgundy region of France. So a lot of these wines that we're thinking of, you're going to hear the country France a lot. But that's because France kind of established a worldwide recognition of wines, as well as Italy and the Middle East and the Mediterranean. So Pinot specifically was a varietal that was most commonly grown in the Burgundy region of France and still is, and makes some of the world's most expensive wines. Pinot is tricky. Pinot is typically one of the first varietals you're going to harvest coming into the cellar. It's a thin-skinned grape. It's very prone to sunburn. It has a very lovely aromatic profile if you handle it well. And it responds really well to challenging winemaking, unfortunately. So oftentimes you will hear people talk about whole cluster pressing or whole cluster fermenting their Pinots. So what that means is, and I don't know if anybody follows me on my social media, but when we get Pinot in at the winery and we take anywhere from like 50 to 70,000 tons of fruit a year. So per vintage, when we get Pinot in, we're foot stomping it still. And that's to very lightly extract some of the juices, and they're on stem at that point. So if you get Pinot coming into your winery and you want to kind of extract some of those anthocyanins and polyphenolic compounds that are in the stems as well as the seeds and the skins, you'll do a whole cluster fermentation with a very gentle pressing at first. And you may also do what's called a pre-fermentative cold soak. So what that looks like from a practical perspective, if you're doing actual like foot pressing, is someone, me, is standing in a bin with a bunch of grapes and some dry ice, realistically. And so it looks really funny because you like drive up to the crush pad and there's just some chick in a bin with a bunch of grapes that look like they belong in a Halloween store because there's dry ice in it, and it's just like coming up and like going over the top of the bin. So it looks like I'm some wine witch coming out of a bin of Pinot. But if you do that to Pinot, it makes some really lovely aromatics. So hi, Owen. And so Pinot is really fun to play with from a winemaker's perspective, but that's why I typically don't advise people to buy Pinot for like less than $20 a bottle because it's such a pain to make well. But when it's made well, it is absolutely beautiful. And now Pinot is grown in a lot of places. Pinot is grown in Oregon, in California, in Alsace region of France makes some really cool Pinot. Australia has some fantastic Pinots. New Zealand has some wonderful Pinots. There's a lot of Pinot, and Pinot is going to be, as a varietal, very specific to where it comes from, unfortunately. So oftentimes when I get like a Willamette Pinot, so an Oregon Pinot, Oregon state in the United States, it's kind of mushroomy, kind of earthy. If I get a Central Coast Pinot Noir, it tends to be, and these are all generalizations, of course, but it tends to be very fruit forward, very like raspberry, cranberry, a little bit of dusty, leathery sort of underpinnings. And then the ones from Burgundy, France tend to just be kind of velvety, lightly cherried, and more ripe red fruit. So Pinot is a varietal that can wear many hats, suffice it to say. Jenny, seriously, 50 to 70 tons. Yeah, I pardon my French, but I shit you not. It's a lot. And oddly enough, that'll only make about, I don't know, a few thousand cases, maybe 4, 5. I don't remember the exact numbers of cases. I don't think about our case count that much. I think about how many freaking barrels I have to take care of, right? So, but that's a small to medium-sized winery, which is kind of insane. Is Pinot the only type that does foot stomping method? Another good question, Kyle. No. There are a few other varietals that you can do that with. And we do very light. So let's talk about the word press. I've said we press our grapes a lot, and I've never really explained what that word means, I don't think, but I think the other winemakers have before. So the process of pressing grapes just means, how am I going to get the juice out of the grapes so that I can start fermenting it and turning it into wine? And you can press it by putting it in a bladder press. You can press it by stepping on it with your feet. You can press it just by squeezing the hell out of it. And so we foot stomp Pinot because we are trying to do a very, very, very light press. Because again, we're going to let it do a pre-fermentative cold soak. And if we get too much juice out, we're going to start a fermentation pretty quick. So you may foot stomp. And I don't actually feel super qualified to answer this question, to be perfectly honest, because I haven't worked with a lot of other varietals and gotten my hands on them. But I would hypothesize that you could foot stomp anything that you wanted to do a pre-fermentative cold soak on with a very, very light pressing. And those varietals are going to be things that are very thin-skinned typically. That's my answer. I wish I had a better answer for you, but suffice it to say, those are the kinds of things that a winemaker has to think about when they're deciding what they want to do with the wine. So, which I haven't even had any of this yet, so hold on just one second. Man, this wine has changed so much over the past 4 years. I've consumed a lot of this wine in my life, and it's changed dramatically. It's gone very like fermented pineapple-y, guava-y. Used to be very ripe, kind of crisp, Asian pear-y. It's crazy how that happens. Wine is crazy, you guys. Wine is insane. So another one of you mentioned that your favorite wine was Bordeaux. And I really liked this answer because it means that you recognized that not all wines are called by their varietal. Some wines, most wines that are non-New World, and we can talk about New World versus Old World in just a second, but most wines that are Old World are going to be called by region. So Bordeaux is a region of France. It's on the Atlantic. It is where some of the most expensive wines in the world are from. And it's split into two banks. You have the right bank and the left bank, and they focus on different varietals. You have one primarily Cabernet Sauvignon based and one Merlot based. I believe the right bank is Cabernet Sauvignon based and the left bank is Merlot based. And those banks are referring to what side of the river they're on. So Bordeaux is also a unique region because you have a couple of rivers that come through Bordeaux. And we talked about this, I believe, last week when we talked about Sauterne, which is a dessert wine from where the rivers of Bordeaux meet that gets affected by botrytis. We talked about botrytis last week as a fungus that sucks water out of wine and changes it completely and makes it this whole new wine. So Bordeaux is in that region as well. And there used to be a handful of varietals, and most of them are still there, that are allowed to be in a Bordeaux wine. But you're typically going to see, and one of them used to be Malbec, actually, well, maybe Malbec is still allowed. I actually don't know if Malbec is still allowed. I'm sorry. I should know that. If anybody wants to look that up and let me know, that would actually be really great. But you're typically going to see Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Petit Verdot, Cab Franc. Those are going to be your main varietals in a Bordeaux blend. And Bordeaux's, there is money in Bordeaux, y'all. Like, a lot of it. And they can pay for new oak, is I guess what I'm getting at. A new French oak barrel is going to cost you about $2,000. So, and these wineries in Bordeaux fork out for it. And as a consequence, a lot of these Bordeaux wines are going to smell more like, honestly, kind of like, maybe this is just like an association, but seriously, it smells like money. Have you ever smelled just dry? This is a weird question. Wine people are so freaking weird. But have you ever just smelled money? Like, do you know what money smells like? That's kind of what Bordeaux wine smells like a little bit. It's got that. It's got this like super dark blackberry fruit, black cherry fruit. Again, because it's Cab Sauv, Cab Franc based, they're going to be in the family of pyrazines. So pyrazines are those compounds that give rise to that green pepper characteristic, that kind of herbaceous characteristic. And then you're also going to get a little bit, depending on what the blend is, maybe some of those white pepper, black pepper notes from the rotundun, which is a cyclic terpene molecule, if it's blended with Petit Verdot or Malbec or anything that has that super spicy characteristic. But overall, Bordeaux is going to have a pretty heavy oak treatment, and you're going to be able to tell that in the wine. So that's kind of unique to Bordeaux. And then someone also said Riesling, which you are also trying to get like kudo points with me, I think, because I also freaking love Riesling. Riesling is a varietal that people oftentimes associate with sweet crap wines, which is really unfortunate. Riesling is one of the most, in my opinion, beautiful white varietals in the world. Riesling is also very high in terpenes. Riesling has that compound we talked about last week that gives rise to that kind of petrol-y, diesel-y character, which some people may hate. I love it personally. So if you're going to smell a Riesling and it's made in a cool climate region, you'll see a lot of Riesling coming out of the Alsace region of France, which is where France and Germany kind of like hang out. Alsace is also fascinating just from a historical and geographic perspective because it sits on the border of France and Germany, which for like 40 or 50 years, I don't know, I'm not good at history, for like, 40, 50 years, whatever. It went back and forth between being under the control of Germany and being under the control of France. So Alsace actually has its own language. It has its own culinary style. It has its own wine style because within 2 generations, you're going to have people like one of them associates themselves with Germany and one of them associates themselves with France. And so as a consequence, in order for that region to just establish itself, it had to make its own language and its own complete culture. So Alsace is fascinating from that perspective. And their wines kind of are expressively unique because they are this unique I don't want to say blend because it's so cliche. It's a blend because it's a wine, but they really are a blend of 2 countries and the 2 countries' ways of approaching both winemaking and food and harvest and all of that stuff. So Riesling is very common to that region of the world. It's also very common in parts of Australia, and you can get a lot of Riesling from Washington as well. So Washington State has a bunch of Riesling in the Columbia Valley in particular. And those were your favorite wines. So I was shocked that no one said champagne. A little sad too, but that doesn't undermine the fact that I was very proud and very stoked that like 4 of you said Malbec. Y'all are awesome. Okay, so let's get to the part where we talk about how wines aren't always awesome. So does anybody think they've ever had a wine that just sucks? You don't know why it sucks, but it just sucks. I was actually talking to my lab mate recently, and she was telling me she went to this nicer restaurant and they ordered a glass of wine. And the wine came to her and she said, "This smells disgusting. This smells like my aunt's attic." And as soon as she said that, I was like, TCA. She's like, "I'm sorry, what?" Dan, like, "Yeah, I have too. I've had some garbage wine before." And when my lab mate said, "Yeah, it smelled like my aunt's attic," and I said TCA, that's because that's a very common smell with TCA, which is trichloroanisole. So trichloroanisole, also known as cork taint, can happen when a particular fungus interacts with a phenolic compound in wine and chlorinates it. And this smells like a wet dog or wet cardboard, your grandma's attic, dusty, nasty, and it should be pretty freaking apparent. And that is considered a fundamental fault in wine. And if you get that in your glass of wine, you should send it back. You should not pay for that. You don't have to pay for that. And it is 110% acceptable to send it back at a restaurant. So the person who's serving you at a restaurant, ideally, should be able to know and smell that wine and say, "Yes, you're right. This smells like a wet dog that got stuck in a cardboard box after a hurricane in my grandma's attic. Don't drink it." This is another reason that we can't take bleach into a cellar. So I don't know if you've ever worked in a cellar before or at a winery. We have to use bleach for a couple of things in the lab, and they have to stay completely separate from the lab. Because if there's any fungus in the winery, remembering that bleach is sodium hypochlorite, chlorine is in bleach. That's why if you want to buy chlorine-free bleach, it's a specific thing that's different. If you get bleach into a cellar and you have fungus anywhere, which is very, very likely, you could potentially create a situation where you have a whole barrel that has this compound in it, and when you go and bottle it, you're going to screw up that whole barrel potentially. So cork taint's a real thing, and it's usually on a cork by cork basis. So it's not usually caused by bleach. It can be caused by bleach. It's usually caused from fungal activity on certain phenolics. And you can also avoid it by having really strict reductive environments in your winemaking process. But about anywhere from, it depends on who you ask, right? If you ask people who create corks to go against cork taint, they'll give you numbers of anywhere from 3 to 5% of bottles are contaminated with TCA. If you ask, UC Davis Viticulture and Enology program, they'll say anywhere from 1 to 3%. That number's been decreasing a lot recently with the rise of screw tops on wines and also with non-natural corks. So a company that does a lot of this is, oh, hey, Susanna, howdy. So a company that does a lot of this is called Normacork. And Normacork specializes in non-cork material corks, and they are resistant to TCA. So is TCA considered a congener? What the heck word is that? I don't know, Dan. I literally don't even know what word you just said. Can you use a different word? TCA is considered a fault. And it's considered a fault so strongly that you can send it back in a restaurant and it's completely acceptable. And if the SOM thinks that you're crazy, tell them that some chick on the internet named Caileen told you that if it smells like a wet dog sitting in a cardboard box in your grandma's attic, set it back. Because you should send it back. Okay. The next one. Brett. Has anybody heard of Brettanomyces? Dan, I'll try. Has anybody heard of Brettanomyces? You may have heard of Brettanomyces in the context of beer making, brewing. Oftentimes now you'll see saisons that are brewed with Brett on purpose. That's what the internet lady told me to do. And they can create these really kind of funky flavors that can be really nice. Kind of this sort of savory, a little bit barnyardy sort of flavor. Again, that can be lovely in beer. It's usually awful in wine. Awful. And Brettanomyces can happen for a number of reasons. So Brettanomyces can come in, it's a yeast. It's a non-Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast strain that can also ferment. Excuse me. Again, you can avoid Brettanomyces by using a really reductive process in your winemaking and trying to create a really robust and vigorous culture of sac right off the bat for your fermentation. But if you do get Brett in a winery, and it can ferment minute levels of sugars and create huge levels of off-target compounds. So it'll smell kind of like manure a little bit, like horse stables, sweat, gamey meats, sometimes Band-Aids. I'm explaining some really lovely things tonight, aren't I? Like the first half of the show is like, these wines are so awesome and they smell so great and these are such wonderful characteristics. And the second part is like wet dog and an attic and sweaty saddles and manure and stables. But in an aerobic environment, Brett can utilize, this is kind of actually pretty neat, but Brett utilizes an amino acid called proline. And this is kind of how Brett can sometimes take over fermentation. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae cannot utilize protein as a source of nitrogen. I don't know if any of you are biochemists out there or know your amino acids, but most amino acids have an amino backbone that has a carbon and a nitrogen, and the nitrogen is a nitrogen that has a hydrogen attached to it usually, and then it goes and talks to the carbon in the carbonyl. But in proline, that nitrogen is tied up in the actual ring of what's called the R group, or the group that changes on amino acids. As a consequence, Saccharomyces cerevisiae cannot utilize proline. So, plot twist, Brett can. So, if you have an aerobic environment, which is again why I say your winemaking can really help to combat this if you keep all your barrels totally topped. But if you're in an aerobic environment and you have a little bit of proline around and a little bit of sugar around, Brett's like, cool, all you can eat buffet of proline because sac can't eat this. And so you can very easily create an environment for yourself where you just allow Brett to propagate. You can control, Brett's also really weird because you can control it at low cell counts and it's not going to be problematic. But if the cell count gets above like 7 to 10,000 cells per mil, you're going to start to have a problem. It can also Brett cannot grow at temperatures below 59 degrees Celsius. So if you keep a cool cell, if you keep a reductive cellar, and if you don't have any sugar around and you're just very, very clean, you can probably fight Brett, but sometimes you just get screwed over. But if you smell a wine that smells like a barnyard or manure or stables or any of that nasty shit I just described, it probably has Brett. And at a wine shop or at a nice wine restaurant, it would be appropriate to send it back. There are some wines that can handle Brett decently well. So Syrah from the Rhone region of France, the northern Rhone region of France, can sometimes handle Brett because Syrah itself as a varietal is very leathery, kind of dusty, dirty, black peppery. And so sometimes if you just get the gamey meat aspect of Brett in a very low cell count number and you have this sort of like duck fatty, prosciutto, leathery, dusty, spicy kind of thing going on in Syrah, it's lovely. But Brett is wretched for Pinot because you got this like, oh, this nice like violet and like cranberries and raspberries and barnyard and manure. It's just awful. Is that yeast the one that makes beer? Yes, it is. So I mentioned earlier, oftentimes you'll see brewers work with Brettanomyces for beer specifically. Like typically a Saison or a wild ale will be fermented with Brettanomyces. Same Brett. Brettanomyces brucinii, I believe is how it's pronounced. 59 degrees doesn't seem like a cool temp, but then again, I live in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah. Cellar temp is around 55 degrees. And a lot of cellars will have a cold room as well. And so you'll have like, potentially your working cellar where you have tanks and fermenters and, all of these things can be at various temperatures, but 55 is like cellar. So anything below 59 can kind of combat Brettanomyces growth as well. Yeah, and you can send out, so the test you send out for Brett is it's a GCMS test, and you test for the phenolic compounds that Brett makes that are unique to Brett. So volatile acidity, Celsius or Fahrenheit? Good question. Fahrenheit. Sorry. I hate when I do that. I always tell people, I'm like, Celsius or Fahrenheit, Caileen, and then I never do it. So I'm such a jerk. But volatile acidity. So we've talked about volatile acidity before in Evenings of Enology, mostly with Megan Bell of Margins Wine, because she's a natural winemaker, and volatile acidity is a problem that a lot of natural winemakers fight. But it can give you this vinegar-y kind of smell, almost like apple cider vinegar. It can range from like moderately tolerable to completely out of control. And unfortunately, VA and Brett oftentimes go hand in hand. So if you have a VA issue, you're probably going to get a Brett issue. If you have a Brett issue, you're probably going to get a VA issue because it probably means that you're in an aerobic environment on accident. And both of those things thrive under aerobic environments. So volatile acidity is caused by various yeasts and bacteria as well. So there are more yeast than just Saccharomyces cerevisiae in wine. Again, there can be Brett, there can be like a bunch of other ones, and those things can create acetic acid. So volatile acidity typically comes from acetic acid itself. And Acetobacter is the bacteria that causes, one of the bacteria that cause acetic acid in wines. And so if you smell a wine that smells kind of like apple cider vinegar or cheap white vinegar or something, that's volatile acidity. And that's something that you also don't want in your wines. Unfortunately, you probably can't send it back. Luckily for you, unless you are in an area like that's really booming with natural wine, which if you're in the Bay Area, by the way, it is, most wines are not going to have a VA issue. The only time you may see a volatile acidity issue or an acetic acid issue is if you're buying a natural wine and those wines are not treated with SO2 and they are native yeast fermented. Those environments can create less reduction, more potential aerobic activity, and you don't combat any fermentations from a microbiological standpoint. You let nature take its course. So just kind of knowing what types of wines VA is prone to can help you to avoid it in the first place. That just may be a whiskey and gin thing, but it's a byproduct of fermentation that is undesirable. Interesting. I don't know about it. I will look it up, though, because I'm curious now. I'll have to look it up tomorrow, though, because I still got to go to the winery after this. Okay. Sorry. Personal moment for me. It's been a week, guys. It's been a week. So another one I wanted to talk about, we're going to talk about overoxidized and reductive wines. SO2, sulfur dioxide, what does that do for wine? Thank you, Jenny. Awesome question. So SO2 is sulfur, yes. So sulfur acts as an antioxidant primarily, and an antimicrobial agent. So what SO2 does is it helps the wine to stay in a reductive environment. It helps to combat bacterial growth, and it helps to allow an environment where SAC can thrive. Because remember, SAC, we're trying to bypass the typical cycle of sugar going through the TCA cycle, not cork taint, the trichloros, the actual, like the Krebs cycle. We're trying to avoid all of the sugar getting into ATP via the electron transport chain. We're trying to force it to go through the pyruvic acid pathway to create ethanol. So we are in an anaerobic environment. We're trying to stay in an anaerobic environment. SO2 is an antioxidant. All of those things make the environment very unfavorable for other bacteria or other yeast to grow. So SO2 is a preservative and an antioxidant in that regard. Howdy. Good segue, by the way, Jenny. So on that note, wines can either be over-oxidized or over-reduced. So it's a preservative of sorts. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that's another thing that's like one of the big differentiating lines between natural wines and low interventions or conventional wines is the use of SO2. So you'll see a lot of winemakers who use SO2 at crush. So what that means is like you get your fruit in and you add a little bit of SO2, or some people bomb it with SO2, but you add SO2 to combat non-SAC growth. And then a lot of wineries will try and keep a level of SO2 in their barrels anywhere from 10 to 15 ppm up to like, I don't know, a moderate amount would be like 50 ppm or so. But just enough to kind of like knock down non-SAC growth. Sorry, SAC being Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So oxidation in wine. And again, this is more of a flaw and not a fault. So TCA, if you get it, cork taint, send it back. Don't drink it. It's a waste of your money. It's a waste of your time. Brett, if you get it and you can handle it, go for it. But it's at high counts, it's going to be really, really undesirable. And if you get it at a restaurant, tell your somm, tell your waiter, your waitress, send it back. Try to send it back. They might not let you, but you should try. Volatile acidity, can't send it back because it's not really... You can't send it back. I'm sorry. That's one of the ones that hasn't been accepted yet in the food and wine industry to send back. But if you get it at home and it's above your threshold, I would dump it down the drain. And not buy that bottle again. So TCA is going to be on a bottle by bottle basis. Maybe this is important to know. So TCA is a bottle by bottle basis. Just because one bottle has cork taint does not mean every bottle is going to have cork taint. It means that one specific bottle was forked up. So send it back. Brett, you're probably going to have more than just that bottle in that lot having Brett. Oopsies. Not always, but probably. So I would steer clear of that wine. Brett's also weird because it can evolve a lot as a function of time, but I would steer clear of that. VA, I would steer clear of that bottling as well, because it's probably going to be consistent among the bottling. Will too much SO2 leave any kind of sulfur smell taste? Oh, Jenny, girl, you're killing it tonight. Yeah. Crazy to talk about. Good idea to talk about. Fun stories to talk about. You're a wizard. Okay. So SO2 will smell like matchsticks a little bit. So have you ever like struck a match, blown it out, and then smelled it? That's kind of what too much SO2 smells like. And so oftentimes in the cellar, we'll use SO2 in a potassium bisulfite solution to clean out our lines. And if we're working with a topping hose, because we're trying to top off all of our barrels, and we're pushing out wine and pushing in sulfur, and we get that fine spot where the wine and the sulfur kind of mix a little bit, and you pour it in a glass and taste it, it's going to smell like matchsticks. So sulfur can smell like matchsticks, but you are typically not going to see levels that high in a bottled wine. So I would guess that most wines in bottle, if they have sulfur in them, are going to be anywhere in the 15 to 50 ppm range, which is not within your sensory threshold. So I've never smelled a bottle of wine where I thought it was over-sulfured, and I doubt we ever will. So it's cool from like a nerdy seller perspective, but as far as like from a bottling perspective, it's probably not going to be an issue that the average consumer is going to see. So, but awesome. Seriously, great question. Oxidation in wine. So a wine that's oxidized is going to taste kind of like bruised fruit. So, and you are probably not going to see oxidation in most wines. And if you are, it's actually probably going to be purposeful. So, and those are things that you can decide if you like. So there's a region in France, shout out to France basically this whole episode, but there's a region in France called the Jura. Jura is the highest latitude, I believe. I think it's even north of Champagne. I should actually look that up. But it's a very northern latitude region of France on the eastern side of France that does a lot of oxidative white wines. So has anybody heard of orange wine before? Orange wine is a wine that's made in a white wine made in a very, very oxidative environment. And what that does is it causes the polyphenolics, or sorry, not the polyphenolics, the phenolic compounds and the epicatechins and the catechins we talked about last week, which are within the family of flavonthreols, to oxidize slowly and change color, which is kind of cool. And that superoxidative process also gives it this bruised fruit character. So you may smell an oxidized wine and it may smell like super, super ripe pears or almost overripe pineapple. Bruised apple is a really common one for oxidized wines. And these are wines that have just been exposed to oxygen for too long. And whether that's on purpose or on accident is, sort of the winemaker's choice. But again, most times oxidation is going to be very, very intentional, especially for the average consumer of wine. So is a flaw an undesirable amount of wine component? So is a flaw an undesirable amount of a wine component that is supposed to be there, but the level is off, and a fault is something that shouldn't be there at all? Yes, correct. So a flaw is something that will make a wine less than desirable. A fault is something that shouldn't be in wine in the first place. Complicated. That's kind of a packed question, actually. So a flaw is something that most people in the wine industry and most consumers would consider undesirable. A fault is something that should not be in wine in the first place, which is why, and this is the fine line of why you can send some things back and why you can't send other things back. If it's a fault, if it shouldn't be there in the first place, like TCA is the classic example, trichloroanisole or cork taint. Cork taint should not be there in the first place. And it is a fault. It is not a part of the winemaking process that anybody's ever going to try and put in their bottle. You can send that back. If you think your wine is over-oxidized, if you think it's over-reduced, if you think it's potentially has volatile acidity, that's kind of a flaw because there's already acetic acid in wine. Wine can already be oxidized. It can already be reduced. It's just how much of it is there. And if it's too much, you're probably not going to enjoy it, but it's not a fault. It's just poor winemaking, and you probably shouldn't buy that wine again. So that's kind of like the fine line difference. But that's it. That's also another really great question. Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate that question. Oh, man. Okay, hold on. Hold the phone. Is anybody else drinking wine, or is it just me? This is great. I love Viognier. This wine, for example, is getting a little over-oxidized as a function of time. It's turning into kind of overripe guava, overripe pineapple, little Asian pear still, which is kind of nice. But yeah, it's getting up there in age for its little lifespan. So wines that are reduced. So if an oxidative wine is a wine that's been exposed to oxygen for too long, and it's going to give you this sort of nutty, bruised fruit kind of character, a wine that is reductive in nature didn't see enough oxygen, and it's typically actually going to come off as like sulfur compound smells. So you may smell what's typically referred to as the family of beta mercaptans. So mercaptans are sulfur compounds. And sulfur compounds are very common in a reductive winemaking process. And so those wines may smell kind of sulfury, not like rotten eggs sulfury, but kind of like plastic balloons, or a little bit of that egg, like rotten egg smell, but not so bad that it's intolerable, ideally. But those are characteristics of a wine that has been over reductive. So certain vessels are oxidative and certain vessels are reductive. Stainless steel is reductive. Oak is oxidative. Amphora are oxidative. So foudres are oxidative. The foudres are just big barrels, basically. And if you had a wine sitting in either a keg or a stainless steel tank for most of its life, it may be over-reduced and may be unenjoyable as a consequence. Cool thing about wines that are super reductive is sometimes if you just pour them in a glass and let them breathe for a while, you can solve a lot of your problems. So if you open a wine, crack it, smells kind of plasticky, a little sulfury, whatever, maybe throw it in a decanter, see how it changes. And hopefully that will solve some of your problems. Rubber bands. Yeah, rubber bands. Kind of weird, but there's a lot of weird stuff in wine. I'm telling you, it's a weird world we live in. The wine world, that is. So just to recap quickly. So today we talked about some of your wines that you enjoy. Started off with Malbec. First started in Cahors region of France and then migrated to Argentina, where now it's living a lovely and thriving life. It's in that family of Bordeaux varietals that we talked about: Cab Franc, Cab Sauv, Merlot, Petit Verdot, Malbec. So it has some of that pure Zinnic quality to it that you see in Cab Franc and Cab Sauv, that sort of green peppery characteristic. We talked about Pinot as a varietal being kind of a pain in the, but a really great varietal as far as expression is concerned because it's very unique to where it grows. And we talked about some of the region that Pinots grow in. We talked about how Pinot is a very thin skin to flesh ratio, and as a consequence, tends to be very light in body, but heavy in aromatic profiles. Talked about Gewürztraminer and Riesling, which are in the family of wines that are very common to the Alsace region of France and also to Germany and other regions of France. These wines are very high in terpenes. So terpenes being those compounds, like if you've ever heard of limonene, limonene is a terpene, carvone is a terpene, which is the one that gives like that kind of minty smell. Peppermint, spearmint, I believe. There's also Moscato we talked about today. Moscato is tricky, but fun. Moscato is the Italian word for muscat, which is a varietal. There's over 200-ish different varietals of muscat. And typically you'll see Moscato or Moscato d'Asti as a sparkling wine, or frizzante, meaning lightly sparkling wine. Anywhere from 5 to 9% alcohol by volume, and not always. Moscato typically has residual sugar in it, which is why people tend to gravitate towards it because it's a little bit sweet, which is nice. Someone also said vodka, by the way, in the answer thing, and I don't know anything about vodka, really. So I'm sorry, I cannot help you with your vodka question. I'm useless. And then we talked about some of the faults in wine, and we talked about flaws in wine. So a fault that should not be there is TCA, or trichloroanisole, also known as cork taint, which is going to smell like a wet dog sitting in a cardboard moldy box in the top of your grandma's attic. If you get a glass of wine that has TCA at a restaurant, absolutely send it back and have no shame about it. None, nada, nilch. We talked about Brett. Brett is a non-Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeast, Brettanomyces, that you may oftentimes see used in brewing. And it gives rise to this kind of barnyardy flavor, but when it gets real bad, you're going to get barnyard and manure and like horse poop and sweat and gamey meats and stuff. And they're going to produce these nasty smells that you just can't get rid of. It's not going to blow off, probably. It might, but probably not. We talked about volatile acidity, which comes from acetic acid, which comes from yeast and bacteria in an aerobic environment that have decided to make acetic acid and screw you over and make it taste like apple cider vinegar. Sorry, life is pain. We talked about whether a wine is oxidative or it's reductive. So whether it's been exposed to oxygen for a long time, for too long potentially, and can give rise to these bruised fruit kind of nutty characters that can be sometimes really rad and sometimes really like, I didn't actually want to eat an overripe pear tonight. I wanted to have a glass of wine. We talked about reduction in wine and how that's the opposite of oxidation, and how oftentimes when you have a wine that's reductive, you're going to have these characteristics of potentially sulfur compounds, a little bit of like rubber band-y smells, and you may be able to handle that just by decanting it and letting it blow off, but you may also just be screwed depending on how reductive that wine is. And then we talked about sulfur because Jenny is awesome and asked a great question. And sulfur is not a problem that you will probably have to face as a consumer, but sulfur smells a little bit like matchsticks. So, but another thing that can happen in wine, and this is pertinent for the Northern California region of the United States right now, is smoke taint. So if you have a fire before veraison, which is the process of grapes turning colors, your wine may actually smell like smoke. So, and that sucks for everybody, for a winemaker and for a consumer. So sometimes if you get a matchstick quality and you know it's from an area that had a fire that year, it's probably actually smoke taint. And I am so torn on what to do with smoke taint because it's very, very hard to get out. But if you're a winemaker and all your grapes that you have all your contracts for had smoke, you got to make money still. I don't know. Tricky topic, both like emotionally and financially, but that's also a thing that you can smell as a consumer is smoke taint. How much do things change when you're fermenting honey instead of fruit? Good question that I will try and answer in a couple of minutes. So Jenny brought up the beverage of mead. Mead is actually the oldest fermented beverage recorded, interestingly enough. So mead is made from honey, not from grapes. Mead is very viscous, and I have never personally made mead, but I have friends who have made mead. And from what I understand, it's a very, very slow fermentation, like years. So wine can be anywhere from, honestly, like a week sometimes to a couple of months, maybe longer if you're in a stuck ferment or it got cold and you're in a slow ferment. But mead apparently, and I'm not an expert in this, and I don't claim to be an expert in this, mead can take 4 frickin' ever, but it's delicious. Oregon and Washington got hit pretty hard by fires too. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't want to talk too much about climates and fires and wine at the end of an hour-long Evening of Enology episode, but suffice it to say, yeah, it's rough for the wine industry. And I actually got to go, guys. This has been awesome, by the way. I've really enjoyed this episode, and I really love that you guys gave me some of your favorite varietals and your favorite wines, and I hope you learned something about your favorite wine. And if you have any questions still, please feel free to leave them in the SciCommunity page. I got to go back up to the winery and handle an instrument that's just trying to crap itself right in the middle of harvest at the most inconvenient time. So I am grapes at 6 this morning, grapes until 10 o'clock at night tonight. This is what it's like being in the wine industry during harvest and being in a PhD program. Isn't it awesome? Anyway, I really had fun tonight. I hope you guys are enjoying wines. If it's a reasonable hour to enjoy wines, go fix the stirry thing. Yeah, seriously. All right, I gotta go. You guys are awesome. I'll talk to you next week. Bye. Bye. Wait. Cheers. And thank you for sitting through the technical difficulties. The internet's hard sometimes.